Alright, so I'm here again with Randal Koene, and we're going to do a quick interview, an extended one from what we just did previously. So, now, you've talked about substrate independent minds. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that, especially, okay, let's just say, go back for just a second and say, what do we mean by a mind? What is a mind? What is a brain? Um, a mind, at least in the way I define it, and most people who believe at least in physicalism or functionalism, so that there is actually some connection between how we think and experience things and the processing in the brain, um, we would say is the functions that are being carried out by the hardware that is our brain. That is one way to look at that. And so if we say substrate independent minds, the notion is that instead of carrying out those functions in the biological brain, in that kind of an operational environment, you carry it out somewhere else. The So it's like an emulation of the activity carried out in the brain. But I want to make a distinction between some terminology here, between substrate independent minds, whole brain emulation, and what is commonly known as mind uploading. Mind uploading is a term that's well known in the transhumanist community. It was used long before I got involved with this, so before 1994. And it basically, it's a little confusing because it talks about a process, and it's not exactly clear what you do with it once you've uploaded a mind. Do you just store it somewhere? What do you do with that? What does it mean, mind uploading? And how is that different from mind downloading and offloading and side loading and all this other stuff? So the term is a bit vague, and I'd like to just use uploading as the idea for taking something from a biological brain and moving it somewhere else. So the process of moving it without losing your identity, without losing everything that's there, that I think is a good use for that term. But to make things more clear, I think it's good to think about what is the objective, and the objective is to run the mind, so everything that you experience right now, in another substrate, in some other framework that can operate. And because we don't understand very much about how we think in abstract terms, we don't really understand how all of this works in terms of large-scale functions, we have to think in terms right now of the actual neurophysiology and neuroanatomy going on. It's the only area we can really work on at the moment. So all real research is going on in this particular way of implementing substrate independent minds that we call whole brain emulation, where you just say, okay, let's look at the whole brain, let's look at all of the components that are in there that are actually doing something useful for thinking. So all of the neurons, all of the synapses, and other components that may be important, say maybe glial cells, are you doing something useful? And come up with other ways to implement those, implement them in another hardware, and do that faithfully, and make all the connections correct. That's whole brain emulation. So think of, for instance, emulating a PC on a Mac, and you want the PC program still to run just as it did on an actual PC. That's the idea with whole brain emulation. You want the same mind functions to still work as they did before, but in new hardware.
Do you think you'll be simulating some form of competitive gene structure underneath this, so to provide some sort of the same motivations as we have today in our biological substrate?
I think that if you're doing a whole brain emulation, so if you're really faithfully copying what is carrying out the thought functions that we have, and you also take into account diffuse effects, things like hormones and other chemicals that are affecting how we think, then you're going to have to implement something for those as well. And by doing so, by replicating all of that, you're automatically replicating those things that we consider our drives, our basic drives that are instilled by evolution, are still there. You haven't really modified that yet because you've copied all of the components, that the operational components that our genes have developed inside of our brains and whatever else you need to copy to make this sufficient. That's a whole other topic. What's the scope? Is it just the brain? Is it the brain and the spinal cord? You need the body. How much of the embodiment? You need to be completely connected to the environment through a robotic body or something like that, or what is sufficient for that? That's another topic. But if you really do this faithfully, yes, then you're copying all of those drives as well.
People have said that well, the brain and our evolved substrate is a messy bit of spaghetti code or firmware. Do we need to replicate the messiness?
You don't necessarily need to. This is kind of what I'm alluding to in terms of the difference between substrate-independent minds and whole brain emulation. If we knew exactly what we were doing, if we understood the brain well enough at an abstract level so that we could say, oh yes, this group of neurons here, messy as they are, however they're connected and however unreliably every independent component works, they're actually doing this function X, then you could develop that function X in some other efficient form that works better on the hardware that is then intended to run on. But in the absence of all that detailed knowledge, it's safer to emulate in as much detail as we can. And that's all we can do right now, is to try to at least build tools that can acquire the data that we need at the level so that we can do that kind of a faithful emulation. That's why all the people actually doing research in this area are doing it that way. That's different from AI, for example, where you do tend to make these abstractions and just assume that you know what you're doing. Eventually, I do hope that, let's say you could move, just to use more terminology from computing, instead of building an emulator, more of a compiler, where you take what you've learned from the brain and you transform it in a way where it is implemented in a more efficient way in the hardware that it's intended for. Eventually, but not yet.
Okay, that's a good analogy. So, do we have the computational resources yet, or do you think we really need to sort of wait for a few more doublings of Moore's law?
It's a little bit of guesswork, because whether we have the computational resources necessary depends a lot on the ultimate resolution that you require to make a faithful copy. So, is neurons and synapses enough, or do you need to go down to the molecular level? Or if that's not enough, do you need to go even lower? Do you need to do something, I'm not going to say atomic because that's just way down, but do you need to go even further perhaps? I don't know, but my guess, just from experience with models in neuroscience, other neuroscientists, what they feel is correct, and looking at which changes you can rely upon and which ones are affected too much by noise in the environment, it seems like neurons and synapses are probably enough. So neurons at the level of the spiking neuron, and synapses, you go a little further into chemistry because you need to understand what the channel types are and how they respond. So sometimes you need to dive a little deeper, sometimes not so much. And just guessing based on that sort of awareness, I would think that yes, we have enough computational resources in the world, certainly, and probably in large computational facilities to run what we would consider a single whole brain emulation. That doesn't mean it would be cheap or easy, but I think we do have it.
Okay, well, what neurons are about, 25 watts, is that correct? Each?
No, the entire set. So our entire brain
is
on
okay.
Something between 15 and 25 watts. Yeah, it's incredible, really, when you think about that. Yeah, and a supercomputer runs, God knows, kilowatts the whole time.
Yeah, that's right. So, do you think we'll ever be able to develop computers that run at that sort of speed? I mean, sometimes
Absolutely.
neurons aren't actually functional or operational.
Yes, exactly, and that's smart design. It means, why should you consume resources when you're not doing anything? If there's no information coming your way, if the functions that you're connected with aren't being used at this time, why should you be, running through clock cycles and doing stuff? Why not just sit there? That makes sense. And if you have a lot of parallel processing elements, like in the brain, you can do that. And I do think that we will be able to build those things, and there's no reason we shouldn't, because we can see, right here that it's possible to build something like that, so why not?
Do you think we'll need to incorporate any of the magnetical sort of activity in the brain? Like, there's a phapsis, and that sort of plays alongside the action potentials.
Sorry, I'm not quite getting what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I mentioned a phapsis. It's sort of a magnetic effect in the brain. It's sort of like, I think, as far as I understand, it's the action potential which sort of helps decide what to do, and the phapsis primes the part of the brain or the cluster of neurons that are meant to.
Well, okay, it's not just that what you're referring to. This is a more global issue, is that you do need to also include the modulating effects in the brain. Say, for example, pyramidal cells in many parts of the brain will operate in different modes depending on whether they're receiving acetylcholine or not. And in the absence thereof, they're kind of asynchronous, and they just spike whenever something happens, and they participate in these propagating waves of activity. But if you have acetylcholine in there, then they'll become spiking neurons, and they'll have oscillations that are going on, for example, at theta frequency, and you can do things like learn. And these modes, those are important for the brain to work properly. And it's like you're saying, decision modes as well. Like in the prefrontal cortex, there are different functions for different parts of the mini columns that are there. You need to take into account how those are being modulated by diffuse effects, whether they be magnetic or chemical or otherwise. So yes, and we do need to have a good understanding of the different modes that these areas of the brain and cells can be in at different times. So there's a lot of experimental work that needs to be done on a functional level to do that, to figure that out.
Okay. Well, so actually, this. You might not have an exact answer for this question, but I have to ask because people like to know. When do you think it's going to be feasible to upload Substrate Independent Minds? Practically.
Of course, I have to ask that. Yes. How much money are you giving me? it's no, I'm just joking, but it is definitely true that how fast you can do something is a direct function of how much effort goes into it. How long would it have taken, for instance, to develop nuclear energy or nuclear weapons or anything like that if there hadn't been a Manhattan Project? So, sometimes people decide to put a lot of, and that's maybe a bad example. Maybe the Apollo Project's a better example because it seems more benign.
Point, yeah.
But regardless, whether it's benign or not, the point is that when people put a lot of effort into something, it goes faster. Put very little into it, it goes very slowly, like the space program recently. So that's really hard to answer. But I think that it is certainly possible that if we put a lot of effort into it, this could be accomplished in a number of decades. And if there's very little effort, it would be a number of centuries. So I do think that there isn't anything really, there's no really huge physical stumbling block there. There's nothing that is so bizarre to us that we cannot possibly understand it until we have a general fundamental understanding of laws of the universe or something like that before we can figure out how to make an emulation of a brain. It's really almost an engineering problem. It's how do you make tools that can acquire this data at large scale, at high resolution, and then how do we build the emulating functions for those? It's an engineering problem with some science questions that still remain, but they can be compartmentalized, and you can get people working on it. Just put the effort in.
Yeah, I think I have a view very similar to Ben's, that we need some very intelligent AI, maybe AGI scientists, very articulate AI scientists to help work on some of the problems that require more than 7 plus or minus 2 slots of memory to work out to solve.
Why? Which particular problem is it that you think requires that?
Some of the really complex ones, like which is maybe understanding some of the really difficult parts of understanding of the brain. I'm not a scientist though, so my speculation is purely.
I mean, I don't really to debate this or anything, but because it's something that I've come across many times, and I've discussed it with Ben so many times, I just don't understand it. I don't understand that approach because, okay, first of all, this is an actual project that people who work in neuroscience understand how to take apart, and that's why people are already working on it. That's why connectomics is such a hot topic right now. It's not as if there's anything really bizarre or complicated in there that goes beyond our current understanding of physics. So why not start working on it now? Why wait until we create, basically AI gods that can do it for us? That's kind of like throwing your arms up and saying, oh my God, I don't know what to do. Let's just wait until we have someone better there to do it for us. And that's not necessary, firstly, because we can do this. Sure. Secondly, it would require putting another question mark underneath the question mark of how to do whole brain emulation, because we don't actually know how to make super intelligent AI either. So you're taking something you don't know how to fix, or that we actually do have a plan for how to fix and how to do, and put another question mark underneath it to solve first. Don't know if that's really smart. I don't quite get it.
Well,
plus that people in some areas would say that it's dangerous to do that because, what if the AI turns evil and we all become enslaved, I'm not going to go there, but sure, you can
Sure.
consider
Yeah,
that.
that's a completely different topic. I was just thinking, well, we do use a lot of intelligent algorithms now to help us solve problems
Yeah,
in
I mean, I'm
databases.
not
So there's a
saying
lot of
don't
data
make
mining.
AI. I think
But I mean, I'm saying like
building
you don't need
things
to have
a
an
computer
AI
program to
god to
help you is
start with.
good.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
agree. So do you think whole brain emulation or substrate independent minds will be able to work in parallel with organic minds with the original substrate? Would we be able to extend our minds through these emulations as well as keep our own in our
Hmm.
head and interface between them?
Until If you had asked me this question last year, then I would have said eventually yes, because we will eventually be able to build uh, nanoscopic probes good enough so that you could have basically electrodes sitting next to each one of your neurons, listening and stimulating and being in touch with an exterior version of your brain or some other extension. But that's far away, and perhaps we should pursue another path first. Today, I would say yes, definitely, because fortunately, I've noticed that some of the people that I'm in contact with are actually working on building exactly those kinds of probes. So it looks like that may be coming along a little faster than I had imagined about a year ago.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Awesome. I like that answer. So, are you in favour of instant uploading or gradual
Sorry,
uploading?
am
Like,
I,
are you in favour of or are you in favour of
oh,
instant uploading?
okay.
You know
I
what I
tend
mean?
to call
The
the one
gradual uploading,
I
instant
tend to
uploading.
call the one discontinuous versus the other one, say, gradual or something like that, because this is, of course, aiming directly at the philosophical question of what is it to be yourself? What is your identity? Can you turn yourself off and on again? Can you turn yourself off, then turn yourself on somewhere else? And is that you if the brain has the same memories and stuff like that, but there's no other connection between you?
Can you merge?
Do you need to maintain continuity throughout the process? Do you have to replace one neuron at a time or something like that? There's all these questions and procedures that are linked to whatever you believe is the truth there. And I have heard many arguments from both sides. Personally, I was a fence sitter for a very long time, and I still sort of am, that anytime someone comes to me with one side of the story, then I will argue the other one. But recently, I had a very interesting conversation with Max Moore talking about this problem of personal identity and what it actually means to have this concern about losing yourself. Because we don't have this when we think about, okay, when I was 5 years old, I wasn't exactly the same person I am now. And yet I do feel that there's continuity. If I have an accident and a part of my brain is damaged, if that part isn't too large, I probably have some sense of continuity. If it's a really large part, or if I suddenly feel like two separate persons, like when you have this colostomy and then you get, the two sides of the brain are not communicating well with one another, there might be so much change that even though the post-operational person, of course, feels like themselves because that's the only sensation they can have, it may not really be as if it's a continuity from the same person on. There can be massive changes that change who you are. So according to Max, which I think is a good approach, the problem isn't so much whether or not you're moving into a different kind of substrate. It's not whether you're doing it through something that's discontinuous or gradual. It's more about how much changes. So let's say if it was a process where you suddenly wake up in another body, in a different environment, that could be too much change to make it the same as, say, you yesterday and you now being the same person. Whereas if you have a connection, if there's a gradual process and it's more like a brain-computer interface that gradually becomes you, it could be less, let's say, traumatic, and it could be more acceptable to yourself that this is a continuity. After all, we generate much of our reality the whole time, right? I mean, we sort of confabulate most of what's going on. So my feeling is that the discomfort that I've had between these two positions as to how much of this idea of identity is actually real, how much is it an emergent phenomenon and really just kind of something that's, I don't know, we imagine. I think it has a lot to do with the sense that the change between one instance of being and the next instance of being is not too great to make it possible to feel that this is a continuity of the same thing, of the same identity. I do think that means that you need to take into account as part of the procedure, if you're doing something like an upload to a substrate independent mind, that it shouldn't be too jarring in a sense.
Yeah.
And that may actually mean that you need to take the same approach in the end as you would if you had to do in-place replacement of neurons, if you had to do it very gradually. I'm not sure how gradual, but I kind of see where that makes sense. So I'm less of a fence sitter now in that sense.
Yeah, I do agree. I'd rather be. I feel as though I'd rather be gradually replaced. Having one neuron taken over by some form of nanotechnology at a time, or a few at a time, rather than just being sort of wiped out and then appear in cyberspace. So, do you think it's possible to have many copies of the same mind? And if so, do you think that it's possible to have them merged?
I certainly think it's possible to have many copies. Let's begin with the idea of everything being connected. So this gradual offloading or uploading process where a neuron becomes connected with an artificial version of itself, and both of them are doing the same thing, processing the same input, generating the same output. In that case, all you've done is you've made the system more robust, because you've basically, it's like having a plane with two engines instead of one, in case one of them fails and you don't crash, right? So you've just made something more robust by making a copy. You do this for the entire brain, now you've got two brains. Now, if you have 2 or 3 or 4 copies, but then you allow them to experience different things, in other words, process different input, then of course they begin to diverge. There's nothing wrong with this. You've created multiple, initially identical persons that have the same identity, and then they become different. They start to become someone else. How you merge it back together, I'm not entirely sure. I could imagine that there's some way of combining the output or putting together experiences. Really, that, in my opinion, goes beyond our current understanding of neuroscience or psychology or the brain and memory and things like that. I don't know how it would work, but it seems like something very interesting to explore. So I certainly wouldn't say don't do it. I would say let's find out what you can do with that. It's really interesting. One really cool thing, of course, about anything like substrate independent minds is that most procedures that you do experimentally could be carefully backed out of, or you can have sort of a backup of yourself running at the same time, and the version that you're testing something on is sort of just being run 1 second ahead or something like that. So you can do all sorts of careful manipulations when you're trying out new things, which you can't do currently for testing drugs or something like that on people. You have to just go for it and see if it kills anyone. So
I guess it'd be good if we had very good virtual copies of the human physiology in the mind to be able to test on, rather than test on people or animals. Another question is, do you think that one day it will be possible to have some sort of hive mind structure? Do you think we'll all be able to be connected?
Well, I mean, why not? We're already connected, right? I mean, you and I are connected right now by communicating with one another. You can come up with all sorts of means of communicating that are more intense than before. In the past, people used to send each other letters once a month, and now people can communicate every day, and maybe someday you can... Well, there's what's his name again? I forget the guy who is the cyborg guy at MIT. His name eludes me at the moment, but he was telling at one point...
Kevin Warwick?
Sorry?
Kevin Warwick?
Yeah, no. Warwick is the one at in England, but this is at MIT. Different guy.
Steve Mann.
Yeah, Steve Mann. That's it. Steve Mann. Right. So he was telling the joke at one point where he said, yeah, his wife gets to watch what he's doing through his camera that he has on one of his eyes all the time. So in a sense, they're in a kind of communication that's much more intimate than the communication that most people might have. And you can imagine that there can be many ways of intensifying that further and further, up to a point where maybe you can, in fact, glimpse what other people are thinking, or maybe the thoughts begin to feel like your own. I don't think it's impossible to create something like a hive mind, though I wouldn't know exactly how to set it up right now. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, it's not like just copying a termite mound, is it?
Yeah, it's not exactly the same thing.
So, space is particularly harsh. If we're going to be spacefaring type peoples, we're not going to find it very easily to travel vast distances through solar winds in our biological form.
No, I find that whole concept, every time I see these, people constructing these ideas of giant spaceships with huge groups of people traveling in them for hundreds of years, quite ludicrous, really, because why would you do that? It will probably take less time to engineer ourselves to be able to live in other environments than it does to travel in ships like that to get somewhere. Which means, first of all, you don't need to go to another habitable planet because you could live anywhere in space right around our solar system and you can keep on going as you want to. And secondly, you can actually experience the other environments properly. Because right now, if you travel to the moon, you still have to take a little bubble of the Earth with you. You need to be at least inside a spacesuit, which means you're still breathing air, smelling your own body odors. Just basically, you're in there, encapsulated in a piece of Earth, and maybe your spacesuit can touch a rock or something like that. So not only is it that you can't survive in another environment, it's that you can't even really experience it. If you really want to experience something different, you need to be built to do so. You need to be able to live in that environment to experience it properly. So I think that the sensible approach, that's why evolution happened on Earth as it did, and we are as we are, so that we are suitable to our environment. The same way one should be suitable to the other environments you're going to. This is why I think that flexibility, adaptability, and being competitive in that sense in the universe, that's really important. And this is something where Substrate Independent Minds really takes much more into account this idea of universal Darwinism than most other transhumanist ideas that I've come across. Most of them just don't go there. They don't go to really accepting the fact that you need to be adaptable and competitive no matter what the challenge, no matter when or where.
Actually, I did read an article about, just I forget what it was called, just recently in KurzweilAI.net, and it did go into quite a lot of the Darwinistic competition. But I just wanted to clarify, you're not meaning that we'd be competing against each other, or would it just be ideas that would be competing?
I'm seeing this more as a very general concept. The idea of universal Darwinism is that competition is a natural thing that goes on everywhere all the time, not just in organic environments, not just between species and within species, but even between inanimate things like, large asteroid hits small, very dense asteroid survives, large asteroid breaks up. There was a kind of competition there. Something happened. There was a new effect. The order of things was changed. The environment changed. You have different objects continuing afterwards. So there was a natural selection going on in a sense. This idea of selection, that there are selections between things that are more suitable, more able to cope with certain challenges than others, just goes on everywhere. It's just the way things work. You can't escape it. You can only either participate or be selected out. And that's why I think that if you're opting for a way forward, you should opt for one that takes that into account and understands you need to be able to modify and adapt to these challenges.
Sure. I guess to make the point that Darwin's theory of natural selection is like a distributed search mechanism, but in a sense, it's only nearest neighbor search. It doesn't really take the whole landscape of search space into account. It can't jump from one mountain that it's climbed, one mountain probable to another mountain probable very easily. But we can, if we can view and simulate the search spaces as a sort of landscape. And so making rationally intelligent decisions on where to travel next, and seeing something that's far away in search space instead of really close to our nearest neighbours can be beneficial and can be advantageous as well. But that's sort of, in a sense, would be selected for.
It's a kind of selection. It's just not natural selection in that it doesn't use the genomic way of selecting and making a few modifications and moving forward along the paths that those can take. You can make different kinds of leaps, but there's still selection, of course. There's always selection between whatever happens to work better in a certain situation and what works less well in a situation.
Sure. Do you reckon the technological singularity will be achieved through whole brain emulation or mind uploading?
I have a very vague sort of relationship with the concept of singularity, I think, because I'm never quite sure what people are talking about. So I'll just take some form of that, I'll just assume that by singularity you mean something
Intelligence.
where we can't really see what comes afterwards. We can't really understand what the future beyond that is because it goes beyond what we can currently conceive of or understand or predict what's going to happen. There are so many technologies that can lead to that. I mean, could people 100 years ago predict what was going to be going on today? Maybe not. So was there singularity in between there? I think that certainly whole brain emulation or mind uploading or substrate independent minds can bring about circumstances that are so different from what they are now and possibilities so different from what they are now that you could call that a singularity from our current perspective. But so can many other things. And as I said earlier, none of these things are developing in a vacuum. They're all developing together, which is why I always think it's a little bit short-sighted when people are focused only on their area of expertise and they say, oh, this is what's going to change the world, and they're not really taking into consideration all the other stuff that's happening at the same time.
Definitely. Okay, so we mentioned, I pointed you at an interview that you haven't read yet about
Yeah.
sort of synthesizing the cerebellum. You also mentioned Theodore Berger's work. Do you want to talk a
Yes.
little bit about that and why it's interesting?
I would love to, except that unfortunately it's time for me to go to another meeting. If you
Oh,
do want to pick this up again at another time, I wouldn't
absolutely.
mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I found it very interesting. So yeah, let's do that. Yeah,
Okay.
okay. All right, no worries. Well, it's been great, and it has, now it's 31 minutes, so you're probably 1.5 minutes late.
Yeah,
Sorry
that's
about
true.
that. All right, well, thanks very much for the interview. It's been a very great experience. So I've actually learned something while listening to you there. So, yeah, all right. Well, thank you very much, Randall, and look
Thank you.
forward to next time, and also the conference.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Have a nice Saturday.
Yeah, same to you. Cheers. Bye then.